The difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits. Albert Einstein. Stupidity is the basic building block of the universe. Frank Zappa. Intelligent people, when assembled into an organization, will tend toward collective stupidity. Karl Albrecht. The stupidity of the American voter is exceeded only by its slovenliness. Jonathan Gruber. Never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. George Carlin. Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Martin Luther King, Jr. The two most common elements in the universe are hydrogen and stupidity. Harlan Ellison. There's a fine line between genius and stupidity. I have erased this line. Oscar Levant. Only two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the former. Albert Einstein. Life is hard. It's harder if you're stupid. John Wayne. Stupidity is also a gift of God, but one mustn't misuse it. Pope John Paul II. In politics, stupidity is not a handicap. Napoleon Bonaparte. Stupidity is the same as evil if you judge by the results. Margaret Atwood. We are all born ignorant, but one must work hard to remain stupid. Benjamin Franklin.
Okay, settle in, everyone. Have you ever been in a conversation, scrolling through social media, maybe dealing with bureaucracy or just, watching the news, and felt that wave of pure, unadulterated frustration at something that just seems inexplicably stupid?
Oh, yeah.
Like genuinely irrational behavior, choices that seem to defy logic, or beliefs that just feel utterly untethered from reality. You find yourself asking, why would someone think that? Why would they do that?
Is it simple ignorance?
Yeah.
Maybe a lack of intelligence?
Yeah.
Or is it? It's something else entirely.
Or that moment.
Right. Encountering behavior or beliefs that seem to just willfully ignore facts that just don't make sense.
Yeah.
It's a really deeply human experience, I think. And it's one that the collection of sources we're diving into today suggests might be far more central and actually more impactful to our reality than we'd maybe like to admit.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're grappling with in this deep dive. We're taking on a topic that feels, incredibly familiar, maybe even easy to dismiss, but which these sources reveal as surprisingly complex and profoundly significant: human stupidity. We've pulled together a really fascinating stack of material here. You've got classic philosophical texts, some biting social commentary, modern psychological research, even literary analysis.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is really to move beyond just using stupid as like an insult.
Right.
We'll unpack these texts, try to understand the different angles they offer, psychology, philosophy, sociology.
Right.
Look at what might be driving these behaviors, both on an individual level and a societal one, and crucially explore how we can navigate a world where, as some of these sources suggest, stupidity isn't just an occasional annoyance, but maybe a constant force.
A constant force, yeah. So this isn't about pointing fingers. It's really about understanding. We've got some really sharp insights here from people like the economist Carlo Cipolla, theologians and philosophers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Vidal Ronell, psychologists digging into cognitive biases and the Dunning-Kruger effect.
I think it's fascinating.
And social theorists like David Graeber. This collection gives us a truly rich, multidisciplinary tapestry to work with. It shows that this isn't some simple concept with a simple definition.
No, not at all.
It's something that touches on our deepest cognitive wiring, our morality, fundamental social structures, and even, as some sources suggest, the very limits of language itself.
Indeed. It seems less about finding one single, precise definition and much more about understanding the myriad, sometimes really unsettling ways it manifests and impacts our lives.
Okay, so let's unpack this by first trying to get our arms around what exactly stupidity even is, according to these sources. Because, like you said, it turns out defining it is way, way harder than just saying that person is being dumb.
You've immediately hit on the first major challenge that these sources really confront. Defining stupidity is incredibly difficult. The very language we use for it is just so vast, kind of blurry, and often, let's be honest, just loaded with insult.
Right.
Pascal Engel, in The Psychology of Stupidity, he really highlights this difficulty. He points out the sheer variety of terms we throw around, moronic, idiotic, silly, dumb, foolish, inept, the list goes on. And he notes it's frequently just used as a sort of general-purpose term of abuse, often just a stand-in for someone being fundamentally disagreeable or frustrating.
Like just calling someone a con in French, as the source mentions. It just kind of covers everything bad or annoying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Engel uses that example. He knows how con can just encapsulate so many different types of perceived foolishness or, unpleasantness. And this variety, plus the fact that these terms vary culturally. Is tonto in Spanish the same as idiot in English? Does asshole in English perfectly map onto canard in French? It makes it incredibly hard to establish any kind of universal objective principles for what actually constitutes stupidity. It just resists a neat definition because its borders are so porous and tangled up in cultural judgment and, well, personal frustration.
Right. It's not like defining, say, a specific species of bird. It's much messier. And one of the most striking points, I think, from our sources comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer via that Sprouts video source.
Bonhoeffer.
He offers a perspective that just dramatically shifts the conversation away from cognitive ability. He argues that stupidity is, in essence, not an intellectual defect,
Right.
but a moral one.
That's a truly profound and challenging distinction, isn't it? I mean, someone can possess significant intellectual capacity, score high on tests, even be brilliant in a narrow field, and still, in Bonhoeffer's view, be profoundly stupid. He describes the stupid person not as someone who lacks intelligence, but someone who is self-satisfied, easily irritated, and becomes dangerous by attacking others.
Wow.
They are, chillingly, under a kind of spell, as he puts it, easily blinded by slogans, catchwords, or simple narratives, becoming a mindless tool capable of immense evil without even recognizing their actions as evil.
So it's not about being unable to solve a complex math problem.
No.
It's about a fundamental unwillingness or maybe inability to engage critically with reality, to question received wisdom or their own certainties. It's a disposition, not a deficit of processing power. Wow, that reframes everything. It's less about how smart you are in a traditional sense and more about your openness to reality, your susceptibility to influence, and your resistance to critical thought. And Avalon Rennell's philosophical take also pushes back hard against reducing stupidity to just, error.
Yeah, she does.
She suggests philosophy has largely ignored it, often just equating it with simply being wrong or making a mistake.
Yes. Rennell argues that philosophy has conveniently escaped the screening systems that would force it to confront stupidity directly. But she cites Gilles Deleuze, who insisted on the necessity of confronting its troubling facticity.
It's facticity.
Yeah, they suggest that stupidity isn't just a deviation or an error you can correct by learning the right thing. It's something more fundamental, maybe even transcendental.
Transcendental stupidity. What does that even mean in this context, like beyond our understanding?
Well, Rennell explores this. She suggests it could be like an inert horizon, something that's always there, limiting our view or understanding, but which we can't really push past or eliminate. Or perhaps an untouchable center of all relations, kind of core part of the human condition that underlies how we interact, but which remains elusive and resistant to analysis. She highlights how even when someone makes what looks like a simple procedural error, like Thomas Pynchon noting of his own actions, if this sounds stupid, it is. He's implying it's not just an error.
Right. There's something more there.
It's something inherently stupid. It suggests this deeper, perhaps unavoidable facticity to it. It just feels different from just getting something wrong. It carries a weight of maybe futility or inherent absurdity.
So not just a mistake, but a sign of something more deeply embedded in, well, us. Which leads us perfectly to Carlo Cipolla's second basic law, discussed in both the Basic Laws of Human Stupidity and the Academy of Ideas source.
Cipolla's laws. Classic.
This law states that the probability of a certain person being stupid is independent of any other characteristic of that person. Education, job, background, none of it matters for the probability.
This is really where the idea of stupidity as a truly universal constant comes in strong. The Mind Mosaic source elaborates on this beautifully, calling stupidity woven into the very fabric of existence.
Wow.
As prominent as gravity.
Yeah.
It doesn't discriminate based on education, profession, wealth, background, or even apparent intelligence in a narrow sense.
Yeah.
It's not something that humanity outgrows or, decreases over time.
So we don't get less stupid as a species.
Apparently not, according to this view. Humanity just finds more creative ways to show it, adapting to new technologies and social structures. This paints a picture of stupidity, not as some temporary glitch or a correctable flaw, but as a fundamental, inherent, and enduring aspect of the human condition present across all demographics and all eras.
That's a pretty powerful and, frankly, yeah, a little unsettling thought. It's always been here, it's everywhere, and it's not going anywhere. And what's perhaps even more unsettling is how much we consistently underestimate its power. This is Sepola's first and fourth laws, right? Which are echoed across several sources.
Yes. Law 1. We always underestimate the number of stupid individuals in circulation. Law 4. Non-stupid people always underestimate the damaging power of stupid individuals.
And Sepola is incredibly blunt about this. Dealing with stupid people infallibly turns out to be a costly mistake.
Infallibly. You think you can manage it, you think you can reason with it, maybe ignore it, but it always costs you more energy, time, resources than you anticipate. The Mind Mosaic source reiterates this, stating emphatically that stupidity is underestimated, and chillingly, more destructive than malice.
More destructive than malice? How can that be? Malice is, intentional harm, evil.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but this is a really key insight from these sources. The Academy of Ideas source, discussing Sepola, points out how most of us are ignorant to the immense destruction caused by human stupidity. We often focus instead on evil or greed, which seem maybe more dramatic or easier to understand as motivations.
Right, you can see the motive.
Exactly. But malice is often constrained by its goals, right? A bandit wants your money, maybe your property, not necessarily total ruin for everyone, including themselves. Stupidity, however, well, it can cause ruin indiscriminately, without intention, without logic, without limit, often harming itself right alongside others.
Because it's not driven by rational calculation.
Exactly. It's driven by those internal forces we're about to discuss, or by that spell Bonhoeffer talked about. So this consistent theme across sources is a stark warning. We just don't take the impact of stupidity seriously enough, and that itself is a really dangerous oversight.
It's like fighting a force you don't fully recognize or respect, one that operates without predictable motives.
Oh, okay, so if it's so hard to define, potentially a universal constant that we underestimate, where does it actually come from? What are the mechanisms? Why do people act this way?
Right, the why. This is where psychology and behavioral economics offer some really compelling insights. They draw heavily from the foundational work of people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
Kahneman and Tversky, yeah. Thinking fast and slow.
Exactly. As discussed extensively in The Little Book of Stupidity and The Psychology of Stupidity, a lot of what looks like stupidity on the surface can actually be traced back to fundamental aspects of human cognition. These things called cognitive biases and the mental shortcuts we use, known as heuristics. Heuristics, right. These are basically the brain's ways of simplifying a complex world, making quick judgments.
Precisely. The psychology of stupidity calls them intuitive reasoning. That is, rough and approximate, but, crucially, works well enough in everyday life. It allows us to spare the immense labor of meticulous and conscientious reasoning.
Because we can't analyze everything all the time.
We just can't. We are not, by default, perfectly rational logicians or statisticians, as the psychology of stupidity points out. Our brains are efficiency machines, really. And the little book adds that these biases provide a kind of sense of meaningful blindness. They create a simpler, easily understood subjective reality in our minds by filtering out complexity. This helps us navigate the world more easily, even if it's inaccurately.
So they're helpful tools, they save energy, make the world manageable, but they come with significant blind spots and predictable errors. What are some specific examples these sources highlight? I know there are a few key ones.
Yeah, several key biases get detailed. A classic one is the availability heuristic. This is where we extrapolate from information that is easily recalled. Maybe it's particularly vivid, recent, or emotionally resonant. We make it seem more probable or important than objective data might actually suggest.
Okay.
So the psychology of stupidity in the little book give examples like remembering a single highly publicized case of a schizophrenic person committing a violent crime and then concluding that all schizophrenics are inherently dangerous.
Even though statistics show that's absolutely not the case.
Exactly. Or only really noticing trains when they're delayed, leading you to believe they're always late, despite a mostly on-time record.
Okay. You fixate on the easily accessible, vivid examples and then generalize from them. That makes sense.
Precisely. And the little book also notes how just frequency of repetition or mere co-occurrence things happening together, even if there's no causal link, can create what they call illusory correlation.
Illusory correlation.
Yeah, it makes associations feel stronger, more important, maybe even real. This helps explain beliefs in things like lucky charms or ritualistic behaviors. You did something once before you had success, your brain links them, and the repetition reinforces this false connection. Like a baseball player needing to, I don't know, tap their shoe 3 times before batting because they happen to do it during a successful hit once.
That makes perfect sense. Your brain desperately wants to find patterns, so it makes a connection where there isn't necessarily a logical one.
What about loss aversion? This one feels really powerful in how we make decisions.
No, it's huge. This is a core concept in Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory, and it's central to both the Little Book and the psychology of stupidity. Basically, the psychological pain of losing something is significantly stronger, maybe up to twice as strong, according to some studies cited in Psychology of Stupidity, than the pleasure of gaining the exact same amount.
Wow, twice as strong. Yeah. This powerful aversion to loss explains a lot of seemingly irrational behaviors, like investors holding on to losing stocks for way too long, hoping to break even, thereby often incurring even greater losses, just to avoid realizing that initial loss on paper. It also explains why framing is so important in persuasion. People are often more motivated by avoiding a negative outcome, like don't let your buying power decline due to inflation, than by achieving a positive gain, like increase your buying power. Same outcome, different feeling.
Avoiding loss, even if the alternative is a certain gain, because that potential pain just feels so much worse than the potential pleasure. That's a really powerful driver. And related to that is the sunk cost fallacy, right? That feels connected.
Absolutely connected. The Little Book describes this perfectly. It's our tendency to continue investing resources, time, money, effort into something. Could be a failing relationship, a dead-end job, a doomed project.
Yet simply because you've already invested a significant amount in the past. You keep pouring resources in, not because it's beneficial now or likely to succeed, but specifically to avoid the feeling that the past investment was wasted, that it was a loss.
The classic, I've already put 5 years into this awful job, I can't possibly leave now, kind of logic, even if leaving is clearly the best option.
Exactly. You're essentially doubling down on a bad bet because cutting your losses feels too painful. And then you've got hyperbolic discounting, also detailed in the Little Book.
Hyperbolic discounting.
This is the tendency to disproportionately prefer smaller, immediate rewards over larger, delayed ones. It's choosing the immediate pleasure of, say, eating those chicken wings right now over the larger future benefit of saving that money for something important. It's often linked to a kind of YOLO, you only live once mentality, prioritizing immediate gratification, even if it clearly undermines long-term well-being or financial stability. Live for today, consequences be damned, even if those consequences are definitely arriving tomorrow morning. These biases, they really sound like they're largely operating on System 1, right? The fast, automatic, intuitive part of the brain that Kahneman talks about. The part linked to emotion and perception.
Yes, absolutely. The Psychology of Stupidity explicitly connects System 1, that automatic, intuitive, emotional, perceptual system, to the simplification of reality and the generation of these biases. While System 2, the slower, deliberate system for reasoning and control exists, it requires effort. It takes energy.
Right.
And it can also make mistakes or just be overridden by System 1's strong impulses and biases. So, yeah, much of what looks like stupidity is actually our efficient System 1 brain taking these helpful shortcuts that unfortunately come with these specific blind spots and predictable errors,
Right.
leading to actions or beliefs that just don't hold up under logical scrutiny.
Okay, so cognitive biases are a fundamental piece of the puzzle. They're kind of the operating system, in a way, that makes us prone to irrationality. But there's another specific phenomenon that gets highlighted across sources, the Dunning-Kruger effect. This one seems particularly relevant to why some people seem so utterly, unshakably confident in their incorrectness.
Ah, yes, Dunning-Kruger. It's a really important one in this discussion. As detailed in the Little Book and vividly illustrated in that philosophy-coded source, it's a specific cognitive bias. It's the finding that people who are incompetent or unskilled in a particular area tend to dramatically overestimate their ability.
Right.
While, conversely, genuine experts tend to underestimate their ability relative to others.
So the worse you are at something, the more likely you are to think you're actually great at it. And the better you are, the more you realize how much you don't know. That's the paradox.
That's the paradox, precisely. And the core problem, as the philosophy-coded source emphasizes and David Dunning himself famously stated, is that the people most susceptible to it are typically the least likely to recognize it in themselves.
Because they lack the skill to see their lack of a skill.
Exactly. As Dunning put it, the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're a member. Their very lack of skill or knowledge also means they lack the metacognitive ability, the ability to think about their own thinking, to recognize their own incompetence.
That's a terrifying loop, isn't it? You're trapped in your own lack of self-awareness about your lack of awareness.
It really is. And what's particularly frustrating about encountering this, as the little book notes, is that this incompetence doesn't necessarily make people hesitant or unsure. Oh no. Instead, they are often blessed with an inappropriate confidence, buoyed by something that feels to them like knowledge.
It's appropriate confidence.
Yeah. Rennell, citing the writer Henri Michaud, describes the deep despair of encountering stupidity as dealing with boundless certitude, that utter, unwavering conviction in the face of clearly contradictory reality. It drives you mad.
And this inappropriate confidence makes them incredibly resistant to correction, doesn't it? As the little book puts it, they dig in and defend their potentially ridiculous point of view because they find it incredibly difficult, perhaps even psychologically impossible to accept that they are wrong or less intelligent than others. They literally lack the frameworks to even process the corrective information.
The philosophy-coded source uses that incredible, almost unbelievable real-life story of MacArthur Wheeler to illustrate this.
Oh, the lemon juice guy.
The lemon juice bank robber, yes.
Yeah.
He robbed banks in Pittsburgh in broad daylight after covering his face with lemon juice, genuinely believing it would make him invisible to security cameras because he'd somehow misunderstood that lemon juice could be used as invisible ink. His complete failure to understand the concept, combined with his unwavering confidence that it would work. It's a perfect, albeit extreme, example of Dunning-Kruger in action. And it was precisely this kind of misguided, supremely confident incompetence that actually prompted Dunning-Kruger's original research.
That bank robber example is just mind-boggling, but it perfectly brings the abstract concept to life, doesn't it? It shows how someone can be so utterly wrong yet completely convinced they are right precisely because they lack the capacity to see their own error. Okay, so it's not just cognitive shortcomings like biases and these metacognitive blind spots. Are there also deeper emotional and personality factors that drive seemingly stupid behavior?
Oh, absolutely. The Seek Wisdom Zone source, for example, it points out that political decisions and voting behavior aren't solely rational calculations of self-interest, not by a long shot.
Right.
Emotions like fear, identity, and the fundamental need for stability play a crucial, often overriding role. This can lead working-class people, for instance, to consistently support policies or politicians that directly harm their economic interests.
Yeah, you see that happen.
Because they've been convinced, maybe through fear-mongering or identity appeals, that the alternative is even worse, or somehow a threat to their sense of self or their community. Their fears or their sense of identity literally trump any rational analysis of policy outcomes.
That's a really powerful insight into why purely rational arguments often fall completely flat in the political sphere. It's hitting people's system one, their emotions, their identity, rather than their deliberative system, too. What about personality types? The sources mention something about narcissism and a type they actually call the asshole.
Yes, they do. Both The Psychology of Stupidity and the little book delves into this, drawing on work related to malignant narcissism and the dark triad. Yeah, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
The dark triad, right.
The sources describe the asshole not just as someone who's unpleasant, but as a specific personality type who seems to genuinely delight in the subjection and suffering of others. They actively use their position or power, like in a career, to indulge in humiliation and degradation.
Sounds like a toxic boss or colleague many people have unfortunately encountered.
Precisely. They feel above the rules, social codes, and other people. Encountering them often inspires really intense negative reactions in others, either violent and irrepressible rage or a kind of paralyzed stupor. You just don't know how to react. And crucially, The Psychology of Stupidity notes that while objectively they might be wrong, or their actions counterproductive in a broader sense, they often win these showdowns in the short term.
Why?
Because others are so taken aback, or just unwilling to engage in their toxic behavior. And this provides every reason in the world for the asshole to keep on being an asshole. It reinforces their behavior.
Yeah.
Robert Sutton's book, The No Asshole Rule, is mentioned as a direct response to the destructive impact of this personality type, particularly in the workplace.
So their toxic behavior is often rewarded, creating this awful feedback loop that reinforces it. And their apparent confidence, maybe rooted in that narcissism, might link back to that Dunning-Kruger effect we discussed, an inflated sense of self-importance combined with a lack of empathy or objective self-assessment.
Absolutely. You can definitely see how these different psychological dynamics could intertwine and reinforce each other. The psychology of stupidity also links desires like pride, envy, aggression, and domination to phenomena like nationalism, particularly drawing from the analysis of Pierre de Saint-Arclin.
Nationalism is a manifestation of stupidity. That sounds controversial.
Well, Saint-Arclin suggests nationalism provides a really potent sense of identity and superiority, often playing particularly strongly on those who feel inadequate or, in his words, the least sound. It often involves the denigration of everything foreign, a glorification of the in-group, and it taps into those underlying desires for glory, honor, and power. And Ronell adds another dimension to this with the concept of the Dummkopf, the German term for a dull-witted person. She describes this type, citing Jean-Paul, as working only with a known, being a creature of mimesis, with the passive, even dead imagination. Everything is just handed down to him.
So a lack of original thought, just repeating things.
Exactly. This contrasts sharply with the idea of creativity and independent thought being uniquely human qualities. It suggests a form of stupidity is tied to a rigid adherence to received ideas and a deep resistance to novelty or imagination.
Okay, so it's a potent and sometimes pretty dangerous cocktail of cognitive blind spots, emotional drives, and certain personality traits that contribute to acting or appearing stupidly. Now, how do these individual tendencies play out on a larger scale, in society and politics? How do they get amplified or exploited?
Yeah, this is where the Seek Wisdom Zone source offers a really strong argument about manipulation and narrative control as key forces operating in society. They emphasize the absolutely crucial role of media, traditional and social, in constructing dominant narratives and shaping what gets perceived as just common sense.
How is that narrative control actually exercised, according to the source?
Well, it's done through things like careful selection, presentation of information, what news gets covered, how it gets framed, and the sheer repetition of specific messages until they become normalized and basically unquestionable.
Right.
The source gives the example of how consistently associating social protests with chaos, violence, and disruption, even if that's only a tiny part of the reality, makes people automatically develop a negative perception of social movements, regardless of their actual goals, methods, or legitimacy. The association becomes automatic.
And social media just pours gasoline on that fire, doesn't it? The algorithms seem designed to spread engaging content, and negative emotional content is often the most engaging.
Absolutely. Social media algorithms are optimized for engagement, which often means prioritizing emotional content, fear, anger, outrage. This accelerates the spread of misinformation, hate speech, and divisive narratives at incredible speed. People become immersed in an informational bubble or echo chamber.
Right, the bubble.
That constantly reinforces their existing beliefs, even when government policies or societal structures that align with those beliefs directly harm them. The narrative has convinced them the alternative is even worse, or maybe that their struggles are just personal failures, not systemic issues.
It's using those emotional drives and biases we discussed earlier, amplified by technology, to keep people supporting systems or making choices that aren't actually in their best interest. The source also points out how elites use their resources to maintain this control over the narrative.
Yes. The Seek Wisdom Zone source is quite explicit about this dynamic. It argues that elites and those in power will continue to use all available resources to maintain control over the narrative and ensure that the working class continues voting against its own interests. And a key pillar of this narrative control is promoting the illusion of social mobility.
The American dream type idea.
Exactly, that deeply ingrained idea that anyone can succeed and become wealthy or powerful solely through hard work, talent, and merit.
And this serves to justify inequality, right? If anyone can make it, then the poor must just not be working hard enough, or they lack the right attitude.
Precisely. This narrative presents itself as a fundamental pillar that upholds the current system. It justifies existing inequality, it prevents people from questioning power structures or supporting things like wealth redistribution, and it makes people defend a system that fundamentally limits their opportunities because they hold on to the hope that they will eventually be the exception, the one who makes it.
Yeah.
And this discourse actively obscures fundamental structural realities like vastly unequal starting points, a labor market that doesn't simply reward effort alone, and mechanisms of wealth concentration like, tax evasion, financial speculation, political influence that have nothing to do with individual hard work. People are encouraged to believe poverty is a personal failing of attitude, not a result of systemic barriers.
That's a really powerful form of manipulation, leveraging people's aspirations and biases against their current reality and their long-term interests. Wow. Okay, moving from this large-scale manipulation, let's look at a specific social dynamic the sources discuss: the actual act of calling someone else stupid. It seems there's more to this than just a simple description of perceived intelligence.
Yeah, both the Little Book of Stupidity and Avital Ronell analyze this social act, and they reveal its underlying power dynamics. The Little Book argues that labeling someone else as stupid is fundamentally a way of asserting your own superiority. It's pointing out a perceived defect in others, thereby demonstrating your own perceptiveness, and, crucially, your lack of that defect, which is always flattering to the ego. It functions to place yourself above the designated victim.
It's a very quick way to feel better about yourself, isn't it?
It is. And it can lead to gaining social standing. The Little Book suggests that because calling someone stupid is often met with little contradiction. I mean, few people want to risk disagreeing and potentially being labeled stupid themselves, right? It confirms your view and your ascendance on some imagined social hierarchy. Others might even mirror you, using the same labels, as it spares them the mental effort of forming their own nuanced judgment. And this can lead to you becoming the leader of a superior assemblage, a group united by their agreement on who the stupid ones are. The person designated as stupid is then often forced into that role, compelled to submit, to accept ridicule, to fulfill their role as scapegoats for the group's frustrations or insecurities.
Wow, that unpacks a very common behavior in a pretty uncomfortable way. It really highlights the social cruelty that can be involved. And Ronell adds another, perhaps more controversial layer to this analysis, discussing the act of calling someone stupid as a form of political assault.
Yeah, Ronell suggests that labeling someone as stupid, particularly within certain power dynamics, can be a way of destroying an alterity, essentially erasing difference by dismissing the other person entirely. She controversially suggests, based on her reading of certain texts, that calling a woman stupid can even be the beginning of violence, an act of political assault that functions as a performance of power and denigration rather than simply being the cause of later physical violence.
That's strong.
It is. And she points out the discomfort of finding someone who is sensitive to the politics of stupidity in some contexts, like the writer Robert Musil, also participating in this dynamic by saying things like, "There is nothing so stupid as a woman artist." Now, it's really important to be clear here that these are challenging ideas presented within the source material we're reporting on.
Right, we're reporting the source's view.
Exactly, not endorsements of these problematic examples. But they illustrate how the act of labeling stupidity can be deeply intertwined with historical prejudices and power structures.
That certainly adds a deeply unsettling dimension to the discussion, linking this common act of labeling to much larger issues of power and historical oppression. Okay, beyond these interpersonal and group dynamics, the sources also look at stupidity operating within large-scale structures, particularly bureaucracy, through the fascinating work of the anthropologist David Graeber.
Ah, Graeber, yes. His book, The Utopia of Rules, has a really provocative perspective on this. He argues that bureaucracies, while seeming purely functional, are actually utopian forms of organization in a kind of perverse sense.
Utopian, how so?
Because, he argues, they are designed in such a way as to guarantee that a significant proportion of actors will inevitably fail to meet the demands placed upon them, demands which the bureaucracy itself insists are perfectly reasonable.
So the system is set up for you to fail, and then it blames you for failing. That sounds familiar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Graeber sees this as stemming from a kind of naive faith in the perfectibility of human nature on the part of the system's designers. They create procedures, assuming perfect compliance, perfect understanding, perfect access to information standards, which most actual humans, operating in the real world with real constraints, simply cannot meet. He gives these relatable personal anecdotes about frustrating bureaucratic errors at the bank, the DMV, or dealing with companies like Verizon, where the procedures seem almost deliberately designed to make you feel like an idiot, or even lead you to act like one out of sheer confusion and frustration.
Oh, I think everyone listening can deeply relate to that feeling. Running around trying to do something simple like renew a license or fix a billing error, only to be completely derailed by opaque procedures and contradictory instructions. It's maddening.
It is. And Graeber also highlights how bureaucracy entrenches the division between rational technical means and ultimately irrational ends, and makes this separation seem like just common sense. Bureaucracy is incredibly efficient at applying detailed procedures, for rational means, towards arbitrary or ultimately irrational goals, the irrational ends.
Like what?
Well, whether it's a state efficiently pursuing some abstract national destiny or an individual efficiently making vast sums of money just to spend it on, trivialities, this division between the how and the why becomes normalized. And he notes this wasn't always the case historically, where the way one lived or worked was often seen as integral to who one was and the purpose of the activity itself.
And he notes a strange blind spot in academic social theory regarding bureaucracy, too, doesn't he? Like, academics complain about it, but don't study it enough.
Yes, exactly. Graeber finds it quite odd that social theory largely avoids discussing stupidity and violence explicitly, especially concerning bureaucracy. This is despite the fact that academics themselves are increasingly caught up in the administrative tasks and frustrations of bureaucracy, which they often dismiss as merely tacked on to their real intellectual work.
Right.
He suggests that social theory often prefers to focus on more subtle forms of power or discourse, rather than confronting the often crude reality of bureaucratic absurdity, institutionalized stupidity, and the background threat of force that, he argues, underpins these systems.
Speaking of force, the sources also make some pretty concerning connections between stupidity and violence. We touched on Cipolla saying it's more dangerous than malice, but his fifth law states unambiguously that a stupid person is the most dangerous type of person, even more dangerous than a bandit.
Yes, the mind mosaic and psychology of stupidity sources echo this consistently. They emphasize the profound destructive power of stupidity.
Yeah.
Stupid people, according to the Academy of Ideas citing Cipolla, impoverished society, they ruin lives. And if they attain positions of power, they can cause social ruin on a vast scale. Stupidity is described again and again as having an inherent destructive power. Ronell, citing Musil, even links stupidity to a blind urge to escape, an urge rooted in an inherent inclination toward destruction, suggesting it's not just a lack, like a vacuum, but an active destructive force in itself.
And David Graeber takes this connection even further, doesn't he? Arguing that violence, or at least the threat of it, fundamentally defines the parameters of social existence and common sense, calling this the essence of right-wing thought. That sounds like a very strong claim.
It is a strong claim. He suggests that structural violence, the ways systems harm people, often invisibly, is maintained not just by ideology, but by the continual threat of violence from the state or other powerful actors. And people's beliefs, their common sense understandings of how the world works, often serve as psychological accommodations to this underlying reality of force.
So we adjust our beliefs to fit the power structures.
That's the argument. From this perspective, law itself is seen, particularly from a right-wing viewpoint, as analyzed by Graeber, as a means of controlling the very violence that brings it into being and maintains order. Graeber mentions the admiration, in some circles, for the great criminal who makes his own law, citing Walter Benjamin. He suggests that, from this perspective, the successful deployment of violence, even criminal violence, is seen as a form of constituent power, something capable of creating new realities or norms simply through force.
That's a deeply unsettling view that violence isn't just a breakdown of order, but in some views actually foundational to it. And technology, which we often see as purely beneficial, seems to play a very complicated, sometimes negative role in all of this, according to the sources.
Technology is definitely presented as a double-edged sword here. The mind mosaic source notes simply, and perhaps chillingly, that technology just gives stupidity a larger audience.
Yeah.
The speed and reach of the internet and social media mean that biased thinking, misinformation, and the expressions of that asshole personality type can spread faster and wider than ever before, reinforcing those bubbles and undermining any sense of shared reality, just as the Seek Wisdom Zone source detailed earlier.
It weaponizes those individual tendencies we discussed earlier, amplifies them globally.
And Graeber proposes an even more provocative and maybe darker possibility regarding the general direction of technological development over recent decades. He suggests the observed shift in R&D focus, away from things like ambitious space programs or automation technologies, rockets, robots, and predominantly towards information technology and medicine, wasn't just driven purely by market forces.
What else could it be driven by?
Well, he hypothesizes it may have been significantly influenced by a desire for total victory in the global class war.
Wow, okay. How so?
He argues that technologies like information technology are inherently conducive to surveillance, work discipline, and social control. They facilitate the financialization of the economy, leading to increased debt, promote flexible work arrangements that destroy job security, enable increased working hours, and help weaken unions.
So technology developed not just for progress, but potentially as tools of control and economic leverage against working people. That's his argument.
That's Graeber's argument, yes. And similarly, medical breakthroughs like the development of widespread antidepressants such as Prozac or Zoloft could be seen in this analysis as technologies designed, perhaps not explicitly but functionally, to help people cope and remain productive under the increased demands, stress, and precarity created by these new work regimes and societal pressures.
Making people able to tolerate intolerable conditions.
Potentially. He contrasts this trend with an older scientific model he calls open source, or convivial competition, where scholars shared research and findings freely, creating intellectual commons. He laments the current tyranny of managerialism and the creeping privatization of research that restricts the free flow of knowledge and potentially directs innovation towards control rather than liberation.
It seems like a pretty bleak picture when you put it all together like that. If stupidity is this constant, underestimated force amplified by technology, exploited by powerful narratives, deeply intertwined with bureaucracy and even violence, can we actually do anything about it? Can we fight it, or are we just doomed to be overwhelmed?
Yeah, it can feel bleak. But the sources generally converge on one key, perhaps sobering point, reiterated strongly by the Mind Mosaic source. You cannot defeat stupidity.
Can't defeat it.
It's presented as an eternal aspect of the human condition in these texts. You cannot simply educate it out of existence or win a debate against it and expect it to just disappear. Bonhoeffer's earlier point reinforces this, remember? Only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome stupidity.
Liberation from that spell he mentioned. From the certainty, maybe?
Perhaps. Liberation from the grip of slogans, from self-satisfied certainty, from those psychological accommodations to power structures, for those biases that feel so much like knowledge. But the core message seems to be that direct confrontation aimed at eliminating stupidity is ultimately futile. The strategy isn't one of defeat, but one of navigation and self-preservation. Yeah, the Mind Mosaic source urges us to accept that stupidity will always exist, but crucially, do not submit to it. It warns against the extremes of debilitating cynicism, just giving up and letting stupidity win, or obsessive, futile attempts to fix the unfixable.
So, acceptance without surrender. Okay, how do we navigate then? What are the practical strategies the sources offer for living in a world where stupidity is apparently a constant?
Okay, so firstly, awareness is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Learn to recognize stupidity when you see it, and if possible, try to avoid getting entangled in it. That's from Mind Mosaic.
Yeah.
But just as importantly, maybe even more importantly, be acutely aware of your own vulnerability to biases, errors, and acting stupidly yourself. As the psychology of stupidity notes, we are all capable of being stupid. Every single one of us. We are all subject to these cognitive shortcuts, these emotional drives. So practice doubt. Practice verification, which is really the core ideal of scientific thinking, right? Questioning assumptions, seeking evidence. The Little Book points out how rarely we turn our hypercritical eye inwards to see our own biases, our own overinflated confidence.
Self-awareness. Accepting our own potential for foolishness. That seems like the essential first step, doesn't it?
It absolutely has to be. And cultivate a healthy skepticism, especially when encountering information that goes viral or taps into strong emotions. Mind Mosaic again. Just because something is widespread or emotionally compelling doesn't make it true.
Crucial advice in the age of social media and manipulated narratives.
Yeah. Another vital strategy, according to Mind Mosaic, is to choose your battles wisely. You cannot reason someone out of a position they didn't arrive at through reason, especially if it's rooted in deep-seated emotion, identity, or bias. So if a particular instance of stupidity doesn't directly affect you or something you care deeply about, the advice is simple: walk away. If it does affect you, find a way to minimize the damage, but do not waste your limited energy and time trying to convert stupid people. It won't work.
That's hard advice to follow sometimes, isn't it? Especially if the stupidity feels dangerous or morally wrong. But probably essential for preserving your own mental and emotional resources.
It absolutely links back to that idea that direct instruction doesn't work for Bonhoeffer's moral stupidity. Instead of fighting the force head-on everywhere, the Mind Mosaic source suggests a different approach. Cultivate small strongholds of intelligence.
Strongholds of intelligence?
Yeah.
Like what?
Surround yourself with people who genuinely think critically, who value reason, logic, and open-mindedness. Build environments, whether personal or professional, where stupidity has no power, because reason and well-supported ideas have the loudest, most respected voice. Make sure your room values reason.
creating pockets of rationality and thoughtful community in a world that seems increasingly dominated by the opposite. I like that.
Exactly. And related to navigating these situations, sometimes strategic silence is necessary. The Mind Mosaic source draws an analogy here to Sun Tzu, suggesting that sometimes the wisest tactic is simply to remain silent when speaking would be futile or even counterproductive.
Silence as a tactical choice. Okay, so self-awareness, skepticism, picking your battles, building intelligent communities, strategic silence, these are practical ways to navigate. What about when you are the one who does something stupid? Because as you said, we're all capable of it. It's going to happen.
Yeah, it is. The psychology of stupidity touches on this. It defines doing something stupid in part as persisting in error after you've been shown that you are wrong.
Ah, okay. The persistence is key.
Yes. The force suggests that when you make a mistake or do something foolish, you basically have a choice.
Yeah.
You can make honorable amends, own up to it, try to fix it, or you can persist in your error and essentially be taken for a fool by yourself and others. It also highlights the difficulty of genuinely apologizing and taking responsibility, noting how easily excuses can creep in and turn into blaming others. It cites that example of someone apologizing for spilling wine, but then immediately blaming the white carpet for being an unsuitable color for a party in the first place.
Right, shifting the blame subtly.
Exactly. The source suggests it's necessary to make peace with your own capacity for stupidity, accepting that stupid actions or moments are inevitable, and that apologies or attempts to correct things may not always be accepted. You just have to deal with it.
That's a very practical, albeit often uncomfortable, piece of advice for daily life. It brings it right back from the abstract to personal responsibility. Okay, looking at the bigger picture again, is there any hope for society as a whole if stupidity is so prevalent and destructive? Can things get better?
Well, Cipolla, via the Academy of Ideas, offers a potential path, but it's framed as a pretty challenging one. He suggests that societal decline and ruin can only be prevented if the proportion of people who fall into the category of the intelligent increases significantly.
The intelligent category, what does he mean by that?
In his model, these are people whose actions benefit both themselves and others. Their mutually beneficial actions, he argues, can potentially outweigh the damage caused by the stupid, who harm both themselves and others, and the bandits, who benefit themselves by harming others.
Okay.
However, Cipolla observes, and other sources certainly imply, that current social forces seem to be actively moving people away from the intelligent category and towards the categories of bandits or helpless victims of the system.
So the system itself seems to be working against the very increase in intelligence and mutually beneficial action needed to counter stupidity's effects. That's not encouraging.
It's not. But David Graeber offers another approach, rooted in what he identifies as the core of much leftist thought, a political ontology of the imagination, or creativity.
Imagination is the answer.
Well, instead of focusing solely on fighting existing systems head-on, which can feel like just banging your head against that bureaucratic wall of stupidity and violence, he suggests building alternatives. This involves creating holes cut in the fabric of reality.
I like that phrase.
Yeah, me too. Carving out moments or spaces outside of bureaucratic capitalist systems and organizing them based on practical imagination and creativity, rather than rigid rules or top-down authority.
Like grassroots movements, maybe. Mutual aid networks, alternative ways of living and working together, things like that.
Yes, exactly. He cites examples like elements of the global justice movement, or Occupy, which focused on organizing themselves non-bureaucratically, demonstrating alternatives based on direct action, consensus, and immediate practical needs and organization, rather than just distant, abstract millenarian goals. It's about manifesting the world you want to see now, driven by creativity and imagination, which contrasts sharply with that dumb cop's passive adherence to the known.
So building the alternative, powered by imagination, rather than just endlessly fighting the existing system. That's a hopeful, albeit challenging perspective that brings creativity into the picture as a counterforce.
It shifts the focus, doesn't it? From a potentially futile battle with an eternal negative force like stupidity to the positive act of creating and nurturing alternatives where reason, creativity, and genuine human connection can actually thrive.
We've covered a lot today, taking a really deep dive into the multifaceted nature of human stupidity. We've seen it's not just a simple lack of intelligence, definitely not. It's a complex interplay of fundamental cognitive biases, powerful emotional and personality drives, how it gets amplified and exploited through manipulation and within bureaucratic structures, and its concerning links to power and even violence. We've seen that the sources consistently tell us we cannot eliminate stupidity, but we can learn to recognize it, navigate its effects on ourselves and others, cultivate our own critical thinking and self-awareness, and build communities that value reason and imagination.
Yeah, it's fundamentally about adapting to its persistent presence rather than attempting the impossible task of eradicating it entirely, accepting it, but not surrendering to it.
Right. And one striking theme that really resonates across these sources, from the psychological ones to the philosophical ones, is how much easier it is for us, all of us, to see stupidity in others than in ourselves. The Little Book and the Psychology of Stupidity explicitly point this out as just a common human tendency.
Yeah, we're great at spotting it elsewhere.
And the Dunning-Kruger effect, as Philosophy Coded emphasizes, shows us that those most fundamentally affected by incompetence and misguided confidence often don't even have the capacity to recognize it within themselves. They can't see it. And the Psychology of Stupidity notes that stupidity, in a sense, actively defends itself against being discovered or altered.
It possesses a kind of built-in resistance to self-recognition, doesn't it? A kind of blindness to its own blindness.
So here's the final thought to ponder, based purely on what these sources suggest. If stupidity is indeed a universal constant woven into the very fabric of existence, and we are all capable of falling prey to its mechanisms, those biases, those emotional drives, that lack of self-awareness, and if it is incredibly difficult, perhaps even fundamentally against the nature of stupidity itself, to recognize it in ourselves, how can we truly begin to navigate a world filled with this phenomenon? If the first step is self-awareness, but self-awareness is precisely what stupidity resists, how do we even start? Where do you begin that process? That's something to really mull over.